In July of 1518, in a city in what is now France, a woman walked into the street and began to dance. There was no music, no festival, no reason. She just danced, alone, in silence, in the middle of an ordinary working day. By nightfall, she was still dancing. By the next morning, she hadn't stopped. Her feet were bleeding, her body shaking with exhaustion. And still, she danced, as if she physically could not make herself stop. Within a week, dozens had joined her. Within a month, as many as 400. And here is where a strange story becomes a genuinely disturbing one. Some of those people danced until they died. This is one of the best documented mysteries in all of medieval history. It's written into the city's own records, into the notes of physicians who watched it happen. It absolutely, definitely, took place. We have just never been able to fully explain it. The city was Strasbourg, on the border of modern France and Germany. In 1518, a prosperous walled city of the Holy Roman Empire. But prosperous hides what life was actually like for most of the people in it. And to understand what happened that summer, you have to understand the misery underneath the city walls. Because it may be the key to everything. The years leading up to 1518 had been brutal. A run of failed harvests had sent the price of grain soaring. People were starving. Bread, the thing that kept a poor family alive, had become a luxury. And famine was only the beginning. On top of the hunger came disease. New, terrifying illnesses were sweeping through Europe. Smallpox, and a frightening new affliction people were calling the French disease, which we now know as syphilis. And worst of all, the plague itself, the Black Death, still returned in waves, emptying whole households in a matter of days. So picture the people of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, hungry, frightened, watching their neighbors sicken and die, powerless, with no end in sight, and certain, absolutely certain, that misfortune like this was a punishment sent from heaven. That is the world a woman stepped into when she walked outside and started to dance. Her name, in the records, is Frau Trophäa. We know very little about her. We know she stepped out of her house, and we know she began to move, twisting, turning, jerking, and we know she did not stop, not for hours, not when she collapsed in exhaustion and got up again. By some accounts, she kept it up for somewhere between 4 and 6 days. Think about that physically for a moment. Most of us couldn't dance hard for 4 hours. Frau Trophäa danced, with brief collapses into exhausted sleep, for the better part of a week. When she finally stopped, she had reportedly worn the skin from the soles of her feet. There's a strange footnote here. Years later, the famous physician Paracelsus passed through Strasbourg and wrote about the case. His theory? That Frau Trophäa had started dancing to spite her husband. That it began as an act of defiance against a man she resented. Whether or not there's any truth to that, it didn't stay personal for long. Because while the city watched her, something began to spread. Within days, others were doing it too. First a handful, then 30. Then, by one chronicle's count, around 100 people in the first week alone. They poured into the streets and the public squares, and they danced, silently, grimly, with the same desperate, involuntary intensity as the woman who started it. And it kept growing. At the height of it, the records put the number at as many as 400 people, dancing in the streets of Strasbourg at the same time. A whole section of a city, moving to music only they could hear. We tend to imagine dancing as joyful. This was not that. The witnesses were very clear. The dancers did not look happy. Many looked terrified. They cried out for help even as their bodies kept moving. Some screamed. Some begged the people around them to hold them down, to make it stop, and could not stop themselves. They danced until they collapsed, slept where they fell, and woke to dance again. Their feet swelled and split. And as the days stretched on, the exhaustion started to kill them. According to the accounts, the dancers began to drop. Heart attacks, strokes, sheer collapse. One chronicle from the time claims that at the peak of the mania, as many as 15 people were dying every single day. The city had to do something, so it turned to the experts. And here the story takes a turn so baffling, it sounds invented. Except, it's right there in the municipal records. The physicians of Strasbourg examined the afflicted and ruled out the supernatural. They didn't think it was demonic possession. They didn't think it was witchcraft. They reached for the cutting-edge medical science of their day. The theory of the 4 humors. The idea that the body was governed by 4 fluids that had to be kept in balance. Their diagnosis? Hot blood. Overheated blood, boiling up inside the body, that simply needed to be worked out of the system. And the prescribed cure for people who could not stop dancing was more dancing. I am not exaggerating. The city's official response was to help them dance. The authorities cleared out 2 guild halls. They opened up the grain market. They had a wooden stage built. And then, I promise this is in the record, they hired professional musicians, pipers and drummers, to play music for the afflicted. They even brought in healthy, strong dancers to keep the others moving, on the theory that if the sick just danced it all out, the fever in their blood would finally break. It is, without competition, the worst medical decision in this entire story. Because of course it didn't break the fever. It poured oil on the fire. They had taken a phenomenon that seemed to spread by being seen, and they put it on a stage in the center of the city with a live band. The dancing exploded. More and more people were swept in off the streets, and the original dancers, the ones who had already been going for days, were now being kept on their feet around the clock. Bodies are not built for that. The death toll climbed. The cure was killing the patients. Eventually, the authorities realized their catastrophe. They reversed course completely. The stages came down. The musicians were sent away. Public music and dancing were banned outright across the city, except, oddly, at weddings. And then they stopped trusting medicine and turned to faith. They decided the affliction was the work of a saint after all, Saint Vitus. In the folklore of that region, Saint Vitus was believed to hold a terrible power, the power to curse people with uncontrollable dancing. So they gathered up the surviving dancers, loaded them into wagons, and carried them out of the city, up into the hills, to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus. There, they performed rituals over them. They gave them small wooden crosses to hold. In some accounts, they fitted them with red shoes and led them around the shrine. They prayed, and they begged the saint to lift the curse. And here is the genuinely strange part. Around this time, the dancing stopped. By the end of the summer of 1518, the dancing plague had faded away as mysteriously as it began. The streets went quiet, the survivors went home, and the city was left with a body count, and a question that has now outlasted everyone involved by more than 500 years. What on earth had just happened? Here's the detail that makes it even stranger. 1518 was not the first time. For centuries, outbreaks of compulsive group dancing had flared up across medieval Europe, almost always along the river valleys of the Rhine and the Moselle. There are records of an outbreak in the year 1374 that spread through dozens of towns, with people dancing through the streets in great, wild processions. Earlier still, there are scattered accounts going back to the 1200s. People at the time even had a name for it, Saint Vitus's dance. So, whatever struck Strasbourg in 1518 wasn't a one-off freak event. It was the largest, best recorded eruption of something that had haunted this exact corner of Europe, on and off, for generations. Which makes the question not just what happened, but what kept happening. So let's go through the explanations. Because people have been arguing about this for centuries, and each theory tells you something, both about 1518 and about us. The first, and for a long time the most popular, poison. The suspect is a fungus called ergot. Ergot grows on damp rye, the exact grain that medieval Europeans were eating their bread from. And when you ingest it, it can cause violent convulsions, a horrible burning in the limbs, and vivid hallucinations. In fact, the compounds in ergot are chemically related to LSD. Ergot poisoning, known as St. Anthony's fire, was a real and recurring horror of the Middle Ages. It's a tempting answer. Poisoned bread, a city thrown into convulsions. Case closed. Except it doesn't actually fit. Ergotism tends to cut off the blood supply to the hands and feet. It makes movement agonizing, often impossible, sometimes to the point of gangrene. It does not let you dance, in a coordinated way, on your feet, for days at a time. And it certainly doesn't explain the one feature that defines this whole event, that it spread, person to person, apparently by being watched. Poison can make one person convulse. It can't choreograph a crowd. Which brings us to the theory most historians now favor. And it's stranger, and in some ways more frightening, than any fungus. The mind. The leading modern explanation, argued most forcefully by the historian John Waller, is that the dancing plague was a case of mass psychogenic illness, what older generations called mass hysteria. Here's how it works. Take a population pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance, starving, grieving, terrified, certain they are being punished by God. That's Strasbourg in 1518. Now add one more ingredient, a specific, deeply held belief, woven through that exact region, that Saint Vitus could strike sinners with a curse of uncontrollable dancing. When you combine unbearable stress with a powerful shared belief about how that stress is supposed to show itself, sometimes the belief makes itself come true. One person, already at breaking point, slips into an involuntary trance-like state and begins to dance. And everyone watching, primed by fear and faith to believe this is real, contagious, and coming for them next, becomes vulnerable to the very same thing. And so it spreads, not through the bloodstream, through belief. The dancers weren't faking. That's the crucial point. Under enough psychological pressure, the mind really can seize control of the body. They genuinely could not stop, because, on some level too deep to reach, they were certain they were not allowed to. And if that's true, it makes the authorities' response even more tragic. By building the stage and hiring the musicians, they didn't just fail to cure it, they confirmed it. They told a terrified, suggestible population, yes, this is real, it is happening, and it is happening here, in the heart of your city. They turned a psychological wildfire into an institution. Now, if your instinct is that this is just medieval superstition, that people back then were simply more gullible than we are, I want to leave you with something uncomfortable, because mass psychogenic illness did not die in the Middle Ages. It still happens. To us. In 1962, in a girls' boarding school in Tanganyika, modern-day Tanzania, 3 students started laughing uncontrollably. It spread. Within weeks, dozens of girls were seized by fits of laughter and crying they could not control. The school was forced to close. The outbreak rippled out into surrounding villages and affected, by some counts, around 1,000 people, on and off, for months. There are dozens of cases like it, well into modern times. Factories, schools, towns, swept by fainting, twitching, uncontrollable movement, where doctors search for a toxin, find nothing, and slowly realize they are looking at something the mind has done to the body. The dancing plague wasn't a glitch in superstitious medieval brains. It was a glimpse of something that's still in all of us. The strange, powerful, unsettling link between what a group of people believes and what their bodies will actually do. The dancers of Strasbourg left almost nothing behind. A few names, some lines in the city's ledgers, a handful of horrified notes from physicians who genuinely tried to help and made everything worse. But they left a warning too, and it has outlived every one of them by 1,000 years. A warning about how thin the line really is between the mind and the body, and how, under the right kind of pressure, an entire community can lose its footing at exactly the same moment and fall in exactly the same direction. They danced because they could not stop. Hundreds of them, some of them to death. And after 500 years of doctors, historians, and scientists trying to explain it, the most honest answer we have is still almost a shrug. Maybe that's the part that should stay with you. Not that it happened, but that it could happen at all, and that nobody, then or now, can say for certain that it couldn't happen again.